And let us proceed to the next talk of this morning. Which will be from Claudia de Rham, and she will tell us about positivity with gravity. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to start by thanking the organizers as well as some of my amazing collaborators. So what I'll be talking about today is mainly related to those three papers, but it's within a bigger context of various papers in the literature. And part of the questions I'd like to establish is within the type of effective field theories that we have at our disposal to describe the low energy world we have today, how some of those effective field theory can be embeddable within some consistent high energy completion, even if we don't have a complete control or handle on those specific high energy completions. So in principle, we could just start with a specific realization at high energy and build our way down to a low energy unique description of our world. But in reality, a lot of, can you hear me? I think there's a lot of what we do is come up with low energy effective field theories at low energy, and then come up with various types of constraints we can impose on ourselves. It could be observational constraints, it can be theoretical constraints, and it can be the requirement that the effective field theories we're working with can be embeddable within a consistent high energy completion. And I'll be working today mainly within the realm of positivity bounds. Those are complementary to the observational and other theoretical constraints that we have, and also complementary to the swampland program. So it's not exactly a one-to-one correspondence. I'll represent a graph later to show a little bit how this stands in. But when you constrain low energy effective field theories, a lot of the theoretical constraints that you impose on ourselves, past those of stability and viability of the models that we can consider, is that of causality. And I know Simon talked a lot about causality and how this embeds itself in low energy effective field theories yesterday. And I'll go back to some of those descriptions, although I'll take a slightly complementary approach to what he discussed. So particularly when we're dealing with gravitational effective field theories, in many of the low energy effective field theories we're dealing with, spontaneously on backgrounds that spontaneously break Lorentz invariance, so for instance, around a black hole or around cosmology, the speed of low frequency gravitational waves departs from our notion of luminality. And so one way to constrain our effective field theories in a very simple way is simply maybe to constrain the EFT such that the speed is always subluminal. And if you ask me a few years ago, I would say this is certainly something we should do from the outset, and that really allows us to kill almost half of the models we consider, because it's well known that the notion of superluminality, even if infinitely small, is always related to a notion of causality. And I'm sure we all agree that this is something causality is, if there's one thing we would like to preserve, is the notion of causality. But actually, if we try to understand how the low energy models we're considering are implemented within high energy completion, we can see that how the notion of subluminality at low energy is very subtly linked to that of causality, and particularly in the gravitational context, it's not necessarily obvious that the notion of superluminality is always one-to-one related to that of causality validation. And so I'll explain why in a second. But in order to understand how we could have constraints from high energy, and particularly some condition of causality preservation in our model, be it at low energy, at high energy, and throughout the spectrum, it's useful to understand what type of conditions we're going to impose on ourselves, and they will go under the name of positivity bounds. So this is not at all an exhaustive classifications of the type of theoretical constraints we can put from high energy completions, but just to give you a quick cartoon picture of where I like to be discussing, where this talk is, I'll be assuming some type of positivity bounds, or rather, I'll be assuming that whatever high energy completion I have for my model, independently of the number of fields it has, independently of whether it's a weakly coupled or strongly coupled or whatever it is, it could be an infinite number, a tower of higher spin states, independently of the precise realization that we have at high energy, we like to preserve unitarity, locality in the sense that the Froissart bound should be satisfied, some notion of Poincare invariance, and hopefully we all agree that the notion of causality should be present throughout. And so these are the positivity bounds we're going to impose on ourselves today. We can put more constraints on ourselves, or we can break some of those assumptions as well and lead to weaker and weaker bounds. Now, these are not quite in the same plane as the swampland, which is a little bit more conjectural, but there's some complementarity between the type of assumptions that are made and the constraints that we can impose on ourselves within low energy effective field theories. Now, if we consider a low energy effective field theory, the first thing we can do is just take two states and compute a 2-2 scattering amplitude. So I'll just be working with a 2-2 elastic scattering amplitude for today in 4 dimensions. And all I need to know is the center of mass energy square and the momentum transfer. Now I can compute this amplitude within states of my low energy EFT, and I can compute it within a region of validity for my low energy EFT. Beyond this region of validity, there's still a notion of amplitude that exists there. I simply cannot no longer use my low energy EFT to compute it, but I can still define a notion of amplitude beyond this low energy EFT, where the amplitude should remain unitary, for instance, and all of the requirement that I want to impose on myself. Past this region of validity, I may need to include some heavier modes back into the description of what I like to include, back into computing the amplitude. And there may be an infinite number of layers of physics that I may need to include layer by layer, all the way up to an ultimate high energy completion of everything, including a completion of gravity, although I'll start by talking without gravity to start with. Now, throughout this whole spectrum, I would like to maintain my amplitude to remain unitary. And if I further impose some notion of causality, it's precisely this notion of causality which manifests itself under the requirement of an analyticity and allows us to make a connection between some of the requirements, for instance, the Froissart bound, that we impose on ourselves at high energy, and some conditions that we need to impose on ourselves within the regime of validity of the low energy EFT. So even though I can no longer use my low energy EFT at infinitely high energy, some requirements that I like to impose on myself are infinite energy and all the way in the spectrum still leads to some conditions that need to be satisfied within the region of validity of the low energy EFT. So I looked a little bit at the program, and I don't think the derivations of those positivity bounds will be discussed in much details in any other talks throughout this conference. So forgive me if I'm wrong. This is the reason why I just in a few slides go back through the derivation of these positivity bounds very, very quickly. So if you assume that your physics remain unitary, then in practice what it means is that you have the imaginary part of the amplitude remaining positive, or the cross-section being positive if you want to, but it's actually more information than that. On the whole right-hand side of the branch cut. So the imaginary part of the amplitude has to be positive. In practice, it's really the discontinuity of the amplitude, but for today, I'll just mention about the imaginary part of the amplitude. Now, if you further assume Lorentz invariance, which what we require out of it is really a notion of crossing symmetry, that tells us that you have the same conditions between the various channels, and that then directly manifests itself into the requirement that the imaginary part of the amplitude also has to be positive on the left-hand side of the branch cut. So if you have positivity of the amplitude, the imaginary part of the amplitude throughout this branch cut and that branch cut, you can use that to infer some conditions of what the amplitude should be within the regime of validity of the EFT. For that, you further require the notion of causality, which manifests itself under analyticity, which allows you to express the relation for the amplitude within the region of validity with what happens within an arc. And then further assuming the Froissart bound, or some notion of non-locality, some notion of locality, manifests itself under the Froissart bound, which really, this is what I need out of the amplitude. If I send the arc to infinity, my Cauchy integration formula allows me to relate directly the second derivative of the amplitude within the regime of validity of my EFT with the integration of the imaginary part of the amplitude within the branch cut. So this is where the discontinuity along the branch cut comes in. And so that tells us that those requirements of unitarity, Lorentz invariance, causality, and locality tells us that the amplitude within the regime of validity at low energy has to be such that second derivative with respect to the energy square has to be positive, strictly positive. So these are bounds that are already presented in the 80s, but what's been emphasized in that paper by Adams et al. A few years ago is how this can be used now to constrain low energy EFTs, and in particular to connect with the notion of causality at low energy. And typically for non-gravitational EFTs, you can really rely through the intermediary of these positivity bounds on the notion of superluminality as a manifestation of causality, or rather, I should say the other way around, the notion of superluminality as being a manifestation of causality violation if all the other conditions were to be satisfied. In reality, there's an infinite number of conditions that go under the umbrella of the unitarity requirement. You can see that if you expand the amplitude in the partial wave expansion. And so that leads to an infinite number of other bounds at low energy, but I won't mention about them too much for the rest of this talk. And you can do a little bit better than that if you want to. You can go into some improved positivity bounds, which tells us that within the region of validity of your low energy EFT, you can actually compute this part of the branch cut. You can compute and trust it. And therefore, not only should the second derivative of the amplitude be positive, but the imaginary part has to be positive all the way in here. So you can subtract this contribution from the amplitude, and the remainder should really also be positive. So you can make that statement a little bit more precise and tells you that isn't actually is if you could subtract part of the branch cut, you can require some improved positivity bounds on the amplitude to be satisfied. So you remove all the contributions that you know are already present within the low energy effective field theory, and allows you really to target all your attention on the unknown contributions from high energy. And even though you don't know them, you know that they have to respect unitarity. And so that gives you some valuable information that you can use at low energy. So just to give you, to give you some illustration on how this can be used to constraining any type of effective field theory. This is some very interesting work done by Shang-Kyung Zhou, not at all by myself, but in constraining operators that would come for bosons beyond the standard model physics. And in these curves here are more the experimental expected bounds that you can have, and in green are the region of parameter space for physics beyond the standard models for these dimension 8 operators, where you can where you have to be to satisfy these positivity bounds. And so the purpose of these graphs here is really to show you the complementarity that there is between experimental data and those type of positivity bounds. It's not that it's necessarily obvious that we will always be lying in the region of parameter space where the positivity bounds are satisfied from the point of view of experiments or from the point of view of observations. And so there's valuable information to be extracted out of that. This is for physics beyond the standard model in particle physics. Now, if you want to apply the same type of thing for, let's say, cosmology, this is just an example, very merely illustrative example of how you can use this type of positivity priors in the cosmological setup to constrain your parameter, your phase space parameter for models of modified gravity or dark energy. So this is for a particular model of dark energy. It doesn't matter too much what it is. The main the main thing I like to say is that in yellow are the constraints you would have from observations, including various types of observations, and in dark black are the constraints that you would end up with if you further impose some positivity priors. So don't take this too seriously. At this level is mainly illustrative in showing how complementary these type of bounds are from constraints to positivity bounds, but you should really take that with a big, I should say, bucket of salt, because there's quite a lot of caveat that comes in as soon as you're trying to implement these positivity bounds in the gravitational setup, as I'll discuss for what follows. So in the non-gravitational EFT setup, I kind of try to convince you that using these requirements from our high energy completion leads to positivity bounds that have to be satisfied, and some of those positivity bounds manifest themselves under the requirement of subluminal low energy phase velocity. Now, as soon as you're dealing with a gravitational EFT, there's many different question marks that appear already at the level of how justified these assumptions are for your high energy completion. Whether the notion of causality really manifests itself in full analyticity is one open question. Whether I should really impose the Froissart bound in the context of gravity, or whether I should take the notion of locality a little bit differently. There's a lot of open questions already within the realm of those assumptions. I'll remain as conservative as possible, and I will still maintain all of those assumptions within my high energy completion. Particularly, I will still maintain the requirement of Froissart bound. But even if I assume still all of this requirement, the connection between those and the notion of positivity bounds is more subtle in the gravitational framework. And the notion of positivity bounds, the connection between positivity bounds and the notion of subluminality of low energy phase velocity is also more subtle in the gravitational framework. It's more subtle for an infinite number of reasons. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to go through this infinity right now. But you all know why gravity is much harder. It's much harder because of the lack of a full, complete description of the high energy completion that we want, although we can focus on some models. But already just focusing on the low energy EFT, as soon as we add gravity in the game, we have all sorts of frame artifacts, which are completely easy to deal with. So I'm not going to be talking about those today. This is something, it's a small subtlety, but we can deal with those. A much more important subtlety is related to the fact that as soon as we have gravity in the game, and as soon as we're considering some specific configurations, we can't really prevent from spontaneously breaking Poincare invariance. Maybe you have cosmology, maybe you have cosmology, black holes. So there's all sorts of effects that comes in from the spontaneous breaking of your Lorentz background that makes it very hard to directly apply those notion of positivity within the low energy EFTs in those spontaneous background. And this is too hard for me to talk about today. There's been some positive development going in those directions, but I'm not going to be discussing about those right now. The only thing I'll be talking about for the rest of this talk is this third subtlety that arises as soon as we add gravity in the game, which is the fact that as soon as you let gravity play with you, you can't prevent it from affecting everything that you're doing. And so you need to account for the fact that you're going to end up with some gravitational exchange that are going to spoil the applicability of your positivity bounds in general setups. So no matter what you're interested in, even if you just want to do standard model physics or particle physics, as soon as you have gravity in the game, even if you just want to compute scattering amplitude between electrons, for instance, it doesn't matter too much what you want to do. In principle, you always have to include a contribution from the gravitational exchange, even if you're not interested in gravity per se, just the fact that gravity is there ultimately. And so the presence of this gravitational exchange leads to what we call a T-channel pole. So it's a contribution to the amplitude that has a pole at T0. This is just because it's mediated by a massless particle. So the same occurs if you're including the photon or anything like that. But the problem with gravity is that it's a spin-2 particle. And so the residue of this pole grows like S squared, which is just saturating by itself the Froissart bound. So the whole amplitude itself doesn't saturate the Froissart bound, will respect the Froissart bound, but just the pole contribution by itself, if you were to extract it out, would seem to violate the Froissart bound. And so you can't apply the positivity bounds to the remainder of the amplitude itself. That compromises the applicability of the positivity bounds as soon as you have gravity in the game. And you can see that more explicitly in a specific example. For instance, let me take it QED, minimally coupled to gravity. So you know what QED is, and you simply minimally couple to gravity. What has been done a lot, and we know very well how to do, is if you further add a lower level of physics, if you want to, if you integrate out the electrons, you end up with a gravitational Euler-Heisenberg EFT, where you have contributions from the loops of electrons really appearing just as contact terms, and then connections with gravity if you are in the gravitational context. Now, if you are within the low energy EFT, in the sense of the Euler-Heisenberg low energy EFT, you can try to apply the positivity bounds there. And as promised, you would end up, this is some scattering amplitude between photons now, you would end up with a T-channel pole. If for a second you were to ignore this T-channel pole and just looking at the remainder, the contribution to the amplitude that grows like S squared, where typically you apply the positivity bounds, you will see that you have contributions from the contact terms that are the leftover from the integration of the electron loops. And then you have contributions from gravity as well that are suppressed by the Planck scale. And actually by itself, this is kind of a remarkable statement, because it could go towards giving a proof for the weak gravity conjecture, because this contribution here is precisely the contribution also that comes into understanding how the charge of a black hole changes as a function of its mass when you include those operators in EFT. And if this contribution is positive, it will go into proving the weak gravity conjecture, in the sense that the black holes themselves would always satisfy the right requirement.
So
however, it's
10
not
minutes left.
Thank you. However, it's not as simple as just applying this bound here, because you have the T-channel pole there. And actually, if you recall that this contribution is coming from those contact terms in the low energy EFT, in the Euler-Heisenberg EFT, but those were actually, you have contact with those. If you're working with QED minimally coupled to gravity, you can actually compute these loops explicitly and subtract them explicitly from the amplitude. So assuming that your cutoff is not too low, if you were to subtract this contribution from the electron loops and actually everything else that comes in all the way up to the scale from the amplitude, this contribution ultimately is irrelevant. And this is the one that ends up being the relevant one in the amplitude. And you see that it can always come up with a negative sign. So the bottom line is, as soon as you're dealing with a gravitational EFT, because of the presence of this T-channel pole, you can't just conclude that the coefficient of the S squared term has to be positive. A small amount of negativity is typically allowed in any gravitational EFT. This small amount of negativity is related to the cutoff, or is related to the different parameters that you have in the game. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the question session, but since I only have a few more minutes left, let me just go into the implications with causality, or the low energy speed, since that's what I started with earlier. So I try to argue that the notion of superluminality is related to that of causality through positivity bounds for non-gravitational EFTs. Now, for gravitational EFTs, it's a little bit more subtle than that, and we only have approximate positivity bounds, and that means that we shouldn't really impose on ourselves a strict notion of subluminality. Actually, a small amount of superluminality will be allowed for gravitational EFTs, so long as it's sufficiently suppressed by the Planck scale. So let me be clear. Typically, the statement of causality is phrased in the sense of the front velocity, which is the infinite frequency limit of the phase velocity, should be luminal. So the front velocity is luminal, but it doesn't mean that the first velocity at low energy is necessarily luminal. And it can be the case that you have superluminality at low energy, but you still need to understand how this superluminality at low energy doesn't lead to a support outside the light cone in principle. So instead of explicitly computing my support outside the light cone of my retarded green function, what I'll do is just considering some scattering of photons, for instance, around a background that spontaneously breaks Lorentz invariance. Sorry, here it's a scattering of gravitational waves since I'm dealing with gravity. For instance, about a black hole. So let me imagine I use my low energy EFT, which in principle allows for a small departure of luminality of my low energy gravitational waves. And I scatter gravitational waves around a black hole. I lead to some notion of scattering angle, and I compare with what I will have with my high energy gravitational waves, or that will be following my notion of null geodesic. And in principle, as soon as I have a small amount of superluminality at low energy, I can always construct or engineer configuration where I can integrate this small amount of superluminality to lead to a macroscopic effect or macroscopic support outside my light cone. Here, in the sense of scattering about a black hole, what we really compute is the time delay or the time advance, which is related to this scattering angle. And I can compute this notion of Heisenberg scattering time delay, which is the derivative of this deficit. And typically a negative time delay, what we'll call a time advance, would suggest a propagation outside the light cone as specified by the null geodesic, which is what is seen by the infinite frequency gravitational waves or modes that I'm sending in. Now, it was previously argued that, and this is well known that in EFTs this could happen, it was previously argued that while this contribution it can be negative in some very meaningful low energy EFTs, it's still okay so long as the whole contribution includes the one coming from just the fact that you spontaneously break Lorentz invariance, and the EFT correction by itself is positive. But I like to argue that this is actually not enough, because you're really comparing, this is really comparing what your low energy modes are seeing as compared to your high energy modes. And as soon as you have a time advance for your low energy mode as compared to that of your high energy modes, in principle, you can still create support outside the light cone as dictated by your high energy mode. And this by itself will be in tension with causality. So you really need to go out after the fact that this contribution here is negative, and the fact that this is positive or negative as a whole is not really the relevant statement in that question. So if you look at this type of EFTs, in particular, the notion of positivity manifests itself not as a strict positivity for those coefficients, but a small amount of negativity allowed. This, in terms of the time delay or advance that you can allow for yourself, it leads to this coefficient here being negative, so a time advance, but by an amount which is of course suppressed by the Planck scale and the relevant scales in the problem. So if here is the impact parameter, M is a black hole mass, and R is the Schwarzschild radius, and little m will be in effect related to the mass of the modes that you're considering. So the time delay at low energy could in principle be negative, so you can have a time advance, but you can only trust this low energy effective field theory if you're considering it below its cutoff, the scale m. And so that requires all sorts of conditions. In particular, it means that you can't send in modes with sufficiently high energy. Of course, we're sending modes with zero momentum, null momentum if you want to. So there's no notion that k-square has to be bounded, but you need to have this type of invariance to also be bounded by your cutoff. And requiring to be within the regime of validity of UFT tells you that, in a sense, there's a maximal limit on the frequency of the modes that you can send in, which is related to the curvature of the background that you're considering. So if you want to surf on as much superluminality as you want, so get as close as you want to the black hole, for instance, then you'll need to have send-in modes which are lower and lower frequency. So this in particular tells you that if you want to go to have a impact parameter, which is as small as possible, you'll need to compensate that in having asymptotic energy, which is also as small as relatively small. And so there's a trade-off between the two. There's a minimum impact parameter for any fixed asymptotic energy. And so that, when you go back into the amount of time advance that you can allow for yourself in this type of configurations, tells you that this amount of time advance will always end up being much smaller than the wavelength of the mode that you send in. And so in a sense, this is not resolvable. In any variable low energy EFT, which is gravitational, you may have a small amount of superluminality, but it is okay and consistent with the positivity bounds when it is non-resolvable. I should say that this is a very different statement than some notion of having some asymptotic subluminality, as I mentioned before, or from the statement that the amount of time advance is suppressed by the cutoff, is smaller than the cutoff. So I'm not going to go through the details there because I'm out of time, but it's a very different statement from that. And let me just say that as soon as you are ensuring that it's non-resolvable, you also ensure the notion of causality, because you're ensuring that you'll never be able to construct your retarded propagator with support outside your light cone. So since I'm running out of time, let me just thank you now. And this is the summary of what I discussed about. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very nice talk. Are there any questions for Claudia? Simon? You're muted.
Thanks, Claudia, for the nice talk. Actually, I have a question about what's on the slide here. So I should think of ME as a relatively like scale, like the electron mass, right?
That's right.
I'm a bit confused about the fact that this formula is not. If I wanted to describe if I wanted to bound an EFT parameter at a scale lambda, shouldn't that scale? Yeah.
So this ME here, in this particular case, that would be the cutoff.
Okay, it's a cutoff. It's not.
Yeah,
I could take the electron mass less, and the formula doesn't change, right? That's what your improvement does, right? It replaces electron mass by the cutoff scale, right? In this formula, by removing the infrared part of the branch cut, you're removing the divergence as electron mass goes to 0. Is that correct?
So it's a little. Let me go back to here. I'm changing a little bit, running back and forth between the two things. So I think you want to, here to have this ME here. ME is not the cutoff. It will need to be much larger than ME. And I'm actually assuming I have a cutoff much larger than ME to allow for this bound to occur.
That was using the improvement. Can you explain intuitively why the electron mass, why this formula diverge as electron mass goes to 0? Because after you subtract the infrared part of the branch cut, you effectively should be removing sensitivity from the deep infrared.
Yeah, let me see.
At least one would hope that will happen.
So, I mean, you have this coefficient here goes like the electron mass in there already. So here I'm just using this coefficient as going with the electron mass itself.
Yeah, that formula I understand, but that's just the amplitude itself. That's not. I thought that the improvement on the next line.
So the improvement, we remove this, right? But this thing here does go like inverse powers of ME. So it is true that it's not strictly valid when ME goes to 0, and you need to account for other things when the mass itself goes to 0. But so long as it's non-zero and it's sufficiently, I mean, whatever happens at close to 0, you can be under control. And this thing is simply the fact that this thing goes, the contribution from those terms here, it's those terms there, right? Go to 0, or go to infinity.
anyway, yeah, we're just curious about what happens when the ME goes to zero limit, because it's hard for me to understand from the viewpoint of the UV why the electron mass should matter. From the viewpoint of UV couplings. But yeah, that if you don't have an answer right now.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk more about it. Let me try to think about it. I mean, we
can talk later also.
We do go. I mean, it's definitely not strictly valid when the mass goes to zero. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. We need to assume it not to be too small. But I think your question is, what is too small? What is the IR cutoff effectively, right?
Perhaps we can continue the discussion during the discussion time, which actually we are in. But before we go there, are there any more pressing questions for Claudia? Well, there seem to be none. So let's thank Claudia again. And also let's thank all the speakers of this morning session. And we will reconvene in about 25 minutes for the following session.